education is Christ-centered. It's not child-centered. It's not curriculum-centered even. Mm-hmm. It's about regaining to know God aright and love him in our actions, in our life.
Welcome to School Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. School Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling, who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. You can come study Charlotte Mason with me over in the Charlotte Mason Think Tank. Go to afterthoughtsblog.net/think tank to learn more. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 1 graduate. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of The Convivial Homeschool, now available on Amazon. Abby is basically the queen of the School sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Are you as excited about this year's local online retreats as we are? It's coming up soon, but it's not too late to sign up to host a local retreat of your own. Just grab our digital hostess kit and start planning. Our Homeschool Essentials retreats are perfect for homeschool mom groups, even if not all your members are classical or Charlotte Mason. This year, we'll be talking all things habits and habit training. To register to be a hostess or just to attend, head over to scolesisters.com/habit and sign up. Today's episode is the second in our 3-part series designed to get you started on forming an educational philosophy. Whether you have been studying philosophy for years or you are brand new to classical homeschooling, you are going to love today's discussion, which centers on the definition of education. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our School every day. Who would like to go first?
Abby would like to go first. And I am Abby.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. I know that I'm Abby. So there you go. I am actually doing something a little different. I mean, I'm reading lots of things and I've finished a few books, but right now I have been preparing for my art class that I'm teaching. I'm actually teaching the same art class at 2 different co-ops.
Oh, wow. Oh,
yeah. I have decided that my children need more activities and more things with their friends that are good. And so we are joining, we've been in part of a co-op for years, and this is kind of, we're going to do our Shakespeare year. But also we are joining, our church has just started a homeschool group because there are quite a few families who homeschool. And so my kids are going to be able to take choir, an IEW writing class, and then I'm going to be teaching an art class. I'm calling it Eyes to See. And it's basically, we're going to be doing different media to learn about God's creation. So we're going to be doing clay, like sculpting. We're going to be doing watercolor or dry brush, some of the Charlotte Mason calls it. And then we're going to be doing drawing, and we're going to be using things like chalk and pastels and charcoal, just lots of different types of things, but learning how to see things. I can't remember who it was, but I've been reading a ton about creativity and art and how Christians, we need to have this, we need to actually be practicing and making art, right? Music, film, drawing, painting, all of these things, because that is so much part of our culture, and it is, it really speaks to us, and it is shaping and forming us. And so I just have felt I love art. I've always loved it. And so this is just something that I can do that I will really, really enjoy. And so I've just been loving kind of getting back into kind of the philosophy behind creativity and being creators or sub-creators, I think as Tolkien says it.
Yeah.
And, sharing that with kids because they love it. And to encourage them to not stop when it doesn't look good, because so often it never looks the way I wanted it to from my mind to a page. So just getting over that. And and clay is such a great medium for that because it's different than drawing. So we're going to start with clay.
Great.
Cool.
Well, Misty, you want to go next?
Yes, actually. So this is Misty, and my book kind of dovetails with that a little bit. Oh. I am rereading Angels in the Architecture, A Protestant Vision for Middle Earth.
Oh, I read that years ago. I do not remember it at all, other than the cover and that I liked it.
Yeah, I read it. So it came out in like 1998, I think. Yep, 1998. And I read it in the early 2000s, probably right around about 2000, 2001. And I always have enjoyed things set in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And so reading this book over 20 years ago I remember it being kind of confirmation that it was a good thing to like the Middle Ages.
Yeah, for sure.
And it kind of explained what it really is about the Middle Ages that is attractive. And so I am reading it now because it's the book club selection for a local book club that I was invited to join. I call it the Smart People's Book Club. Because I went to the first meeting and like everyone had read the book and they just talked about the book for like an hour and connected it to other things that they had read, and they'd all read different things. And I just sat and listened, and it was awesome.
Is that its official title?
No.
Like, do they know you're calling it this?
No. A few of them might now, but it's officially called the Conservative Minds Book Club. So they started in 2020 and have read some of the same books that I've been reading in the last few years also. And just to really think through some of the issues at play in the political, social scene that's going down right now in America. So it'll be really interesting to talk about this book that's older, but it is kind of the alternative vision, especially like with the Marxist study. We've been reading a lot of analysis of why right now is so bad and how we got here. And this book feels a little bit more like building, like giving the alternative that's not rolling back the clock and trying to go back in time.
Yeah.
But reclaiming what has been lost by first noticing the actual things that have been lost, not just what's bad now, but what is good that has been rejected that we need to reclaim and go and move forward with. And one of the big things is beauty being objective and a priority for culture. And that you can't have, they make the case that you can't have beauty without God. So the medieval period was building a Christendom after the fall of ancient paganism. So after Christ conquered the world in his death and resurrection, we can't go back to paganism. Paganism's power is gone. And so to have any kind of beauty and culture and truth, goodness and beauty, we have to acknowledge Christ as King. I'm only a few chapters in, but I have 2 more weeks to finish it before discussing it. It's been a good reread, and I've appreciated coming back to it.
I was listening to a podcast, surprise, surprise, while I was cooking the other day. And this guy mentioned something in passing, and I was just like hoping so desperately that he would go on, but he didn't. But I think it was on Brett Weinstein's show, and or Weinstein, however you say it. Anyway, the guy was more of a philosopher type than a scientist type. Weinstein's he's a evolutionary biologist or whatever. But they were discussing wokeism. And it sounds like they're both displaced professors who are actually very liberal, but they're not woke. And so it's like they don't bow down enough, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, what was interesting about the conversation is the guy mentioned in passing this embrace of being ugly, which I don't know if you've noticed it lately, because I know you're not on social media, but I've found it really fascinating how much ugliness there is now.
Mm-hmm.
Like purposeful ugliness. I don't mean the type that, you know, deserves our compassion. I mean, like this person could be an attractive person and is choosing to be not attractive on purpose.
Yep.
And how dare you call the ugliness unattractive?
Right. Yeah. It's very interesting. Anyway, he mentioned it in passing, and I just was like, you could tell he had thought about it. He was somehow connecting it to the wokeism philosophically, but it was in passing and he moved on to something else. And I'm like, no.
Interesting.
Especially when you just said, you know, that you can't have beauty without Christ. It becomes at first kind of metaphorically true, because it's when we think back to secular beauty, even 10 years ago, it was the kind of deceptive, you know, beauty is vain kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe the Proverbs 31 woman who, or not Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 7 woman who, you know, looks attractive and enticing, but hers is the doorway to hell. But now I think we're actually at hell just vomited up on the doorstep, and we're all supposed to be like, good job. That's amazing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I don't know. So,
well, it's the chapter on beauty points out that scripture throughout connects beauty and holiness. And so you can't manufacture holiness. There's only one source of holiness. And so that's connected to beauty. And, you know, at the beginning of like the project of modernity, the Enlightenment, it was the assumption that you could have goodness without God. And so there were vestiges for a while, because they still were trying to have goodness, and they're not even trying to have goodness anymore. And so there's definitely no beauty either.
We could do a whole episode on this.
Yeah, we totally could.
Maybe we should sometime.
Objective beauty is the big one.
All right. So this is Brandy, and I'm also doing the reread. So this is like, you could see it. I'm holding it up. Look. My selection is The Happy Dinner Table by Anna. I believe you pronounce it Millon. It's like a French last name. So of course I butchered it again. That's like a podcast rule. I'll say the French words wrong. So I'm rereading it this summer with the teachers that we're training at our local private school. And I mean, the first time I read it, my kids were slightly too old for it, but it just felt very enlightening. And now they're like way too old for it, because this is really about, you know, kids being picky at the dinner table. But it's such a good book. I just can't get over how good it is. And I was trying to think about, you know, why was it so enlightening to me? Because she's trying to embody Charlotte Mason's philosophy, but mainly talking about this one topic of dinner time unpleasantness, shall we say. It dawned on me, I actually think it's because she captured paideia. So when I was reading Charlotte Mason before I read this book, it was all related to our homeschool proper and our lessons. And I maybe had extended the habit training stuff a little bit outside into my mothering. But I don't think I was thinking of it in terms of, if you have real natural laws of education and children are always learning, then it always applies. The things that we know that are true about children and how they learn and how they grow don't turn off just because it's Saturday, you know? And it's not that I was that extreme and that cut and dry, but I think she just opened up to me this whole door of, if I know something that helps a child learn something, I can use that also in their personal life. It doesn't just have to be in their academics, in their school stuff, or anyway, it was very, very helpful to me. And I also think that she is the one who helped me kind of uncomplicate my thoughts about habit. She made it seem much more just a natural part of life and very approachable, and helped me see my third thing. I think she really gave very clear examples of being firm while still being kind and gentle and motherly. So I think lots of times we have this hard time with our authority as mothers. And so it's like we are indulgent and like sticky soft until we're mad. And then we're firm and mean. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the in our flesh natural run of things. And so she just has this way. I mean, I kind of felt like she was kind of one of those magical people that should be like the person who coaches the nannies or whatever, you know, but she really did have this firmness that was still so kind and so human and still allowed for, you know, children to flourish. She wasn't crushing anybody ever. And anyway, I just think it's a wonderful book. And I think even people who have happy dinner tables probably would benefit from reading it. I know I benefited from reading it, even though I didn't have little kids. Anyway, it's been fun to reread and read with some young teachers who are just starting out and learning how to handle a large group of kids. So yeah, that's mine.
Nice.
Hi, Abby here to tell you about the sistership. Do you ever feel frustrated with social media? Scroll looking for good ideas, like beautiful pictures, and follow accounts that portray an ideal? But when you walk away, you feel distracted, dissatisfied, and disappointed with the time that you've wasted? Because what you're really looking for is connection and having real conversations about what matters most to homeschooling moms, about educational philosophy and principles, not just superficial and shallow tips and tricks. Well, the sistership is a place for moms to dig deep into principles and practices, not to waste time. We want to help you connect and find community, not just online, but in real life. The sistership is private, ad-free, drama-free, and free to join. Find your like-minded sisters today. Go to scolesisters.com/sistership.
Today's episode is the second in our 3-part series on building out an educational philosophy. If you recall, this is a follow-up episode to 106 from last season where it was called Stop Looking for Hacks. You Need a Philosophy. And Misty and I brought up 3 questions. So this is the second question that we're dealing with today, which is what is education? I really do think if someone's just joining us, that they should go back and listen to the previous episode before listening to this one. Because I do think they kind of flow in a logical order. Like what is a human precedes what is education? And then the next one we're going to do is going to be what does a fully educated person look like? So finished product kind of stuff. Hey, Misty was saying today, I'm trying to think of how you put it, Misty, that this one makes it really obvious that we couldn't possibly answer the whole question in one episode.
Yeah. I know. I have pages of notes and things. I'm like, I'm not going to get to any of this. It's way too much.
I had such a hard time even organizing it into an order.
Yeah.
Because I was like, does Abby have 7 things? I think
I probably did. I apologize. I was coming back in to delete some things, but
well, if you notice, I just nested some of your stuff under other people's stuff where it fit.
Excellent.
So you get to talk a lot.
Well, I was assigned the Bible, so it has a few things to say.
Might have a couple. Yeah.
And you told me 2, so I was really trying.
Sorry, I was trying to not make the episode 2 hours long.
It probably will be.
Supposedly, we each have 2 points that we're answering. I did try to put this in a logical order, but this question I think is harder because we're dealing, with the question, what is education? You could talk about things like, well, what do you do to educate? Or you could talk about more philosophical sides of what is it in kind of this nebulous sense, or even what is its purpose? So there's just so many angles you can even take on the question that makes it really big and huge. Like I said, I tried to put it into an order, and we're just going to talk through some things. We each brought 2 or 7 to the table. Sorry. And I just want to remind everybody, one of the purposes of this is to help get those juices flowing and the conversation starting, because we are all philosophers. It's just that lots of times nobody taught us to ask the right questions, and we don't give time to thinking through it because our modern world is always telling us that there are more important things than thinking. So like being ugly. Anyway, so with that said, the question is, what is education? And we're going to have Misty start off with her first point, because I was like, oh, we really need to start here because you tied this really to the previous episode, maybe not on purpose, but for sure you did.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite quotes about education is the Milton quote.
Yep. The.
It's probably a better quote than all of Paradise Lost, but that's maybe controversial.
Wow.
That's just because I don't really like Paradise Lost.
Can be said to Misty at schoolasisters.com.
So the Milton quote is, "The end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright. And out of that knowledge, to love him, to imitate him, to be like him, as we may the nearest, by possessing our souls of true virtue, which, being united to the heavenly grace of faith, makes up the highest perfection." So I think education begins by being connected to that idea of what is a person, that a person isn't complete and unbroken. We are broken. We are lacking. And education is a process of restoring some of what we lost. And it's a process of becoming more mature, where I think even in the way humans are supposed to work, we are supposed to mature. That's not just a part of the fall. God called Adam to grow into his job, to get better at it, to work at it and get better at it. That's going to take more work now and more effort. And we have a lot farther to go. And we can't get very far at all without grace and faith. But education is developing a person who is not a blank slate, who is not starting unmarred and perfect.
It's kind of funny. We have to start with this to even think education's necessary. Like if you really think your child's great and just knows everything, then actually parenting and education become almost nothing. I mean, like maybe with parenting, you could say like your job is to protect them and keep them safe or something like that. But then the question would be, well, like, how did all those bad people get here? But anyway.
Well, too, I think, is education just teaching your children things they need to know versus helping them develop and mature properly? And I think that's a little bit of a distinction. Like, is the goal of education, or what education is, just teaching kids facts, things to know, and filling their head? Or is it character development, which isn't divorced from knowledge?
Well, and it's funny. You pointed us back to the first episode, which is what is a human, but you're actually pointing us forward now to the next episode, which is what does a fully educated person look like? Because
that's true.
That's the question. Is it just, knowing stuff and having job skills?
Right. Well, if you did start from a place of believing that children are a blank slate, or starting from being good, then all they're lacking is just knowledge. And so school is just about teaching them the things they need to know. And then we get all surprised when that's difficult. But working through the difficulty is actually where the character development comes in.
That is true.
So that ties to like knowledge and knowing things.
Yep.
Ties into your next point, Brandy.
It does. Because I do think there's two definitions of knowing that float around out there. There's like the classical biblical definition, and then there's like the other one. So my first, I mean, and my job is basically to bring Charlotte Mason and make sure she doesn't feel left out. So I just brought two of her, well, I shouldn't say, yeah, kind of two of her 20 principles to the table today.
The two that that Karen Glass says are all of her principles.
Well, no, doesn't she say principle 1 is the other? I think it's principle 13 and principle 1.
Principle 13 and 1.
Yeah.
Which we talked about 1 last time. So there you go.
There you go. So principle 13 is education is the science of relations. And there are times when I'm like, I wish that she had said it differently, just because I initially interpreted this as some sort of touchy feely girly thing. It didn't take me very long to read past that. But when I was seeing pink lacy blogs 20 years, not quite 20 years ago, but almost 20 years ago, coupled with education is the science of relations and and having only a son at that time, it was like, not sure about this Charlotte Mason thing. And you do meet people who are kind of turned off by Charlotte Mason because they're raising boys and they think that she's like a girl thing.
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting, actually, to dig into what is going on with science of relations. And first of all, I think she is rooted in this definition of man. She talks about firstborn affinities. Basically, he is born to have relationships with the world that God made, with all the different things in the world that God made. So and that makes sense, right? When we think about Genesis, Adam is basically the king of the earth. Well, good king has a relationship with all his subjects, his whole dominion. And so we shouldn't be surprised that children are born to have these relationships. So we get into this idea, though, that to know in a Charlotte Mason economy, really, she equates knowing with relating. She doesn't really separate those things. And yet when we read the Bible, I don't think the Bible really separates those things either. Like, I mean, unless you want to separate knowing and doing in the New Testament, it's very bad. So I think like in we start right out in Genesis but the Bible tells us that Adam knows his wife Eve, and then she conceives and bears a child. And I don't think that's accidental, but we're starting right off with this idea that knowing is relating. So when I read None Greater, right, my favorite theology book, the author really drove home this idea that God is without parts. You cannot separate. You can study his attributes, but you cannot separate one from another. And for me, I mean, I had heard the list of attributes since I can remember, but understanding that they were inseparable, that was a game changer for me, especially when it came to educational philosophy, because it made this idea of education being about knowing, which is about relationships, make perfect sense, because we are made in God's image and God is omniscient. So he knows everything. And he also is love. And those two things aren't separated. So he can't know something without loving something. That's not in his nature. So then when we think about it, as we grow in our knowledge of things in a loving way, we're actually being imitators of God. And for me, that was super huge. So I really think we had a fundraiser in the spring for the local classical school. And we had to put in this little handout. So just some little things that would help people understand what we were about, because classical education is a foreign concept here. There aren't really classical schools. So we had to write this little snippet for the brochure for people who possibly have never heard of this stuff really. And so we put, as a classical Christian school, Providence Classical Academy seeks to train students to love what is good, true, and beautiful, and to prepare them for a life of service to God and their neighbor. And then it goes on and talks about pursuit of virtue, excellence, and different subjects like history and literature and art and music and all that kind of stuff. But I was thinking about how, I don't know how intentional we were being when we said train students to love. But the more I think about education as the science of relations and this idea, I mean, going all the way back to Aristotle, right? That we're training their affections, about how it really is central. It really is central to our understanding of education, that they have been given this great inheritance, but they are supposed to know it and they're supposed to relate to it rightly, which means with love, but also with love
in action.
But I was also thinking just like that has propriety, like it's measured in the right way. Like, because I could love something too much, right? And it could become an idol. So it's ordered love.
Ordered.
Yeah. So that makes me love science of relations so much more than when I thought it was this girly pink lace thing.
Well, mine dovetails nicely into yours.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Because one of the things that education is, I was thinking about Bible verses. And of course, first thing that came to my mind was Deuteronomy 6, 5-9, I think the Hebrews called the Shema, right?
Mm-hmm.
So hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And these words I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. I think most of us agree with this, but even if you do not homeschool your kids, parents are primarily responsible for the education, the influence, and it very much goes into that, right? That's loving what we ought to love, what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And because that starts with loving the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might, and teaching those things to your children.
Yeah. I always think that passage is interesting because it also gives us some methodology, like what education looks like in practice.
Yes.
And there's a lot of talking, which I find interesting as someone who always focuses on books. I'm like, you shall read them, and we're going to read them again.
Well, both are words.
They are. It's true.
Right?
Yes.
So education is word centric.
Yes.
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 They didn't have many books at that time. So it was an oral tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have our oral tradition is now written down. So I think it is the same.
I think so. But I think I do notice a difference when I take the extra effort to not just end with a narration, but to follow up with some little discussion. And I don't mean anything elaborate. I mean like little 3 minutes of, what do you think about XYZ, and
right. Actually talking about it.
Like actually
conversation.
Yes. Which I will say I have a house full of very quiet people. So it's like, we could all not talk if we're not careful.
That is not the case in my household.
Right. You're like, can we please go to all reading?
I would love that sometimes.
Well, then, speaking of methodology, my next one kind of dovetails with that idea because my next one was principle 5. So Charlotte Mason says, education is an atmosphere, a discipline, and a life. And I'm not going to go like deeply into any of this because we actually did whole episodes on this a few years ago. So if anybody wants to think deeply about these things, episodes 26, 27, and 8. So we did 27 and 28. We devoted an episode to each one of those 3 things. So there's an atmosphere one, a discipline one, and a life one. But I was thinking of just briefly defining it. And lately I've come to the conclusion that I think atmosphere really embodies this Greek idea of paideia, that the children are always learning wherever they are. And so atmosphere becomes to some extent a tool for us. We could change the atmosphere in our home in some way, and it changes the way the children are being educated. But the atmosphere is everywhere. And so really then we have to teach them to rightly relate to whatever is happening. Like we, on the way, there's this plastic surgeon that advertises, and anybody from my church who's listening to this is going to laugh. They advertise all sorts of crazy surgeries on a billboard right where we have to turn left, and we get the stoplight is 4 minutes. I have timed it. Where we have to turn left to go to the church office for youth group. So you're sitting there with a car full of teenagers. Like sometimes I have 7 teenagers in my house, and there's like stuff for a butt lift, and there's like boobs, and there's just like all this stuff.
You're going to get us thrown on the explicit list.
Seriously. I was going to, it is like this company. I'm like, why does it have to be right where we're turning with the kids for church? Anyway, so there's like, but see, this is the thing that is part of their atmosphere, and I have no control over it. Right. So
Well, I don't know. Maybe Providence needs to put a billboard up right there.
It's not a bad idea.
Put your mission statement there.
We probably couldn't afford it. It's like one of those digital billboards,
Yeah,
so probably couldn't afford it. But anyway, so we've dealt with it in all sorts of ways. Sometimes we make jokes. Sometimes we talk about who would actually pay for these things. Sometimes we take pictures and text them to people they remind us of. Anyway, the point is that we had to figure out how to help them rightly relate to this thing that they were going to just be around all the time against our will. And I think that's part of atmosphere too. It's acknowledging that we don't have control over the whole atmosphere. And so using it as a tool actually involves like coaching, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So then I'll try to get really fast. I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. Discipline to Charlotte Mason means the discipline of habit, that's our whole retreat right this year.
Woohoo.
So education to her is in some sense the formation, like it is the formation of habits. When you are thoughtfully and definitely forming habits in yourself, in your child, that is education. You're educating them, you're educating yourself. And then finally with life, that is actually a reference to feeding the child a steady diet of life-giving ideas. So that's where the idea of curriculum, book selection, all that kind of stuff is in that part. So that's a really broad definition, but I feel like in many ways that's the whole thing. That's the whole package if we want to talk about what it looks like in the day-to-day to educate. But you had some interesting things that I thought fit with this, Abby. So I cut and pasted them.
Yeah. No, it does. It goes right along with that. One of my 17 points, it is so much about the kind of the air we breathe, right? That atmosphere of our home, but it, by extension, our, extended family, right? Our community, our churches, our neighborhoods, right? Like all of those things are part of that. Like we're being enculturated all the time.
Yeah.
And as, hopefully our children's primary influence, we are talking about those things and also bringing in true, good and beautiful things and training them to love things, right? But one of the things that I was looking at my commonplace quotes and I pulled this one up from Thomas Howard, and it's called from the book, Hallowed Be This House, which is a great book.
Mm-hmm.
But he goes, learning to love is like learning anything else. A great deal of it is a matter of fumbling through the steps until they become automatic and habitual. And that goes a lot with, the discipline of habits and things like that. But learning to love is like anything else, right? It does take a little bit of, fails and restarts and things like that. Sometimes we allow things to come into our house that are educating our children in a way that we no longer want. And we have to, backtrack. And so I do think that it isn't, our tendency is to try to control and figure out if we could just have this perfect set of circumstances and, not allow any of these things, then our kids will be rightly ordered. But the thing is culture tends to just have a way of, seeping in even with best efforts. And education means that we learn to love God aright, right? That Milton quote. So the next point I have that goes, I think, along with this is that, education is integrated, right? It is the whole person, mind, body, and soul, and it's fit for service and our duties, right? Like that's what education is. It's not just the intellectual life, right? We think a lot about just books and learning and things like that, but it is for the whole person, because God sees us as a whole, as a whole person. Yes, we are broken. And like Misty said earlier, right?
We're integrated people. Our body and our mind and our soul aren't disconnected from one another. So in that sense, we're whole. So we want a holistic education.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That informs all of those things. And that goes along with that, the Shema, right? That we are to, when we walk along the way, when we rise up, right? Like it's all the time. It's not just when we're doing school hours and, math can be to the glory of God and under his too, right? It's not just this other subject that doesn't have anything to do with God. Studying the universe and nature and creation, these are all integrated because God created it and we are called to learn about it, right? From that point. So
can I smuggle in another principle?
yeah.
Because in your notes, you said your integration notes, it focused on the person. So mind, body, and soul are not separated. But I'm hearing you actually say what Charlotte Mason says in Principle 20, where she says, we allow no separation to grow up between the child's, between their spiritual, religious life and their intellectual life.
That's right.
So we're not allowed to divide into like some sort of weird sacred and secular thing where we act like, well, this thing over here, like math is a good example, is secular. So God has nothing to say about that. And he doesn't care about that. I think is like, that's the attitude I definitely caught in public school was it wasn't so much that God didn't exist. It was that he was irrelevant to what we were doing.
Right.
So with your integration, you're actually saying God's relevant to the whole project, which makes sense.
Yeah.
Considering the 6th point. So you want to share your 6th point, Misty?
Yes. The 6th point is that education is about growing in wisdom. And this was my favorite part from the Didascalicon from Hugh of St. Victor.
Yes.
Which is that he makes the claim very well that education is about gaining wisdom, which we have all kinds of proverbs about that, get wisdom, whatever you get understanding.
Yeah.
And then Hugh says, wisdom is Christ. So we're pursuing truth, goodness, and beauty. And if we're doing that rightly, we're pursuing Christ because it is all connected, like Abby was just saying. And that means that education is Christ-centered. It's not child-centered. It's not curriculum-centered even. It's about regaining to know God aright and love him in our actions, in our life. And everything that we study revolves around that. And I think that's particularly helpful when math is hard and there are math tears and math drama. It's pretty much always math drama at our house. There's not really history drama or anything. I guess there's writing drama sometimes because no one likes to have their work revised by other people.
It's good for you, but not for me, Mom.
But when we recognize that education is orienting our loves and gaining wisdom through it, then I think that helps us see that we are pursuing that goal as we help our child deal with something not coming easily to them or deal with a lack of understanding, deal with difficulty and struggle, that it isn't just about getting the right answer on the math page. It's a whole process. And yes, learning the math itself will help you get an increase of wisdom and knowledge and understanding of how the world works. But so will the process of learning the math and the struggle that comes as you learn it. It's all of it a part of education.
Yep. Yeah, I was thinking about that, how often we want to skip. We really want to skip the hard part. We want the end results, but we don't want the price that we have to pay sometimes for the end results. But what that really means is we're willing to sacrifice so much because, I mean, you might get the picture, like you might get a 2-dimensional picture of the end result if you could hypnotize yourself into it or something, but you don't get the 3-dimensional living, breathing final product because that is often forged in the fire of the conflict. With the conflict, even just with yourself because of the frustration when it doesn't go right or come easily.
Well, yeah. And we don't admire or appreciate or love things that come cheap and easy. Right. It's
interesting. We want them to come cheap and easy, but we don't appreciate. That's such a good point.
Yeah. Education yeah, education is sanctifying work, right? It is tough. And, wisdom is such a gift from God. We can ask for wisdom and God blesses us with those things, right? I mean, there is biblical examples of that, but I was also thinking about how education transforms us and it changes us and conforms us to Christ, right? There was different examples in the Bible about, Moses was educated in Pharaoh's court, I think like 30 years or whatever. But until he had his burning bush transformation, right? And became a leader of people, like all of those things worked towards that. But I was thinking about the example in the New Testament too, like when Paul was blinded and then suddenly the scales fell from his eyes and he was transformed, right? So these were educated men who became great leaders, but it wasn't until that transformation that God bestowed upon them that they were truly seeing what it was, right? The truth and the reality and the goodness. In my own experience, like, I was raised in secular education and agnostic atheist family. And in, my conversion, right, it is a different thing. You put off that old self and you are putting on the new self. And it's an education and it is a slow process, right? Yes, we have that transforming experience, right? That conversion, but also there's a lot of day in, day out faithfulness, learning to, be integrated to acknowledge God in all things, right? And that takes time.
I think often we acknowledge all of these things that we've said here today are true, and we don't make the connection that they are all related because we have such a tendency to compartmentalize our lives, where there's sanctification and gospel-centered living and character development all on the spiritual side. And then there's learning about the world and learning how to do math and learning knowledge pieces. And it takes time also to see how those all do intersect and relate and build on one another, how they're all connected, because they are all from God and they all connect in God. So if we are setting our eyes on Him and growing in sanctification and pursuing education as wisdom, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter how far we get in math. And it doesn't matter if we never really learn much about the world, as if we're going to develop character apart from knowledge. But all of these things, the scripture is very clear, are connected because these are different ways that we come to know God. The world teaches us about God as scripture does, but God's bringing us up into fullness. And that means integrating all that we know and all that is, because He is the integration point.
Yeah, I was thinking of Psalm, and I just looked it up, so I had the right reference, 24. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. The world and those who dwell therein, like everything is the Lord's, and it is, like you said, all connected.
Like a question that I thought about asking when I looked at the notes was this idea that I think there's a natural rejection for those of us who have been, raised in a secular education system of the statement. There's a rejection of the statement, education is sanctification. Because we say, well, sanctification is like a religious thing, right?
Right.
I mean, it took me a long time. I mean, I was raised in a Christian home, but I was raised in the public schools. And so that separation, even, I think it was why it was hard for me originally to wrap my mind around it. And I think actually what helped me was, many, many years ago, it's probably 15 years ago now, but reading Dr. Grant's, I was like the transcript of one of his speeches for opening his classical school or whatever, but where he talked about education being repentance. And if you think about, well, okay, repentance is tied to sanctification for sure. And I was able to make the connection of education being repentance in the sense that, well, I'm learning something that is true, which means I have to adjust what I previously thought.
Mm-hmm.
Like I might have assumed that this was true in history, but I actually was remembering it wrong. And I read this book and now I have to adjust what I think. But it was like a long road for me to get there. And not in the sense of like, I was rejecting it. I just didn't even understand it because of the fragmentation of just the way that I was taught.
Yeah. The natural question becomes, so are you saying that non-Christians can't have education? And it's like, right. Not complete, not full. They're trying and they can get better than none, but they can't pursue the whole project.
Right.
And get the whole thing without God.
In other episodes, we've already talked about the idea that part of common grace is that a non-Christian could know something and we could learn from them. And when they know something, we probably should learn from them.
Right.
Like, so I feel like we've already touched on that idea that like, it's not like anybody is saying that, but yeah, ultimately, if the ultimate project is reliant on what you were summarizing from Hugh of St. Victor, that we are to grow in wisdom and wisdom is Christ, then they're cut off from a non-believer is cut off from the final stages, which really, instead of seeing that as condemnation, should just motivate us to evangelism.
Yes.
Because we don't want that. I have relatives being raised in non-Christian homes, little kids, and I'm like, I really would like them to not be cut off from this project. So thinking about how that could be possible. Well, is there anything else we should touch on before we wrap this up?
Well, when we were preparing for this episode, I knew I wanted that Milton quote, and I knew that I had it on my blog. And so I pulled up, I have an article on my blog called Defining Education that I wrote in 2007. And I know that I'd been collecting these quotes for at least 2 years. And so I was thinking about figuring out, what does education really mean? Because you have to know what a thing is before you can do it. And in starting to prepare for homeschooling, there were all kinds of books out there for, here's what you do, or here are all the curriculum options out there. But how do you know what to pick unless you know what education is? And so I just started collecting quotes whenever I came across someone who said, education is. Like, if there's ever that sentence, education is, then I would write it down. And that was right about 15 years ago. And it's still an interesting conversation and thing to learn about. And it's something I'm still learning more and more about. It's never been a question where I feel like, oh, I've arrived.
Yeah.
It's a continual development of understanding that I think that's a part of our posture as we learn. And that includes learning about education, is that we aren't trying to figure it out so that we can check it off and move on. But we're always looking to deepen and mature our understanding, because that's growing in wisdom. It's a vast, vast topic that many people have been writing for a very, very long time. And it's a conversation that's not going to end. It's just going to keep developing, and you can jump in and continue. We can each continue to develop our own understanding and our own educational philosophy. Which
they get a chance to do in the sistership, right? You're going to post.
Yep.
This will be invite people to add their own thoughts on all of this.
Yep.
That's right.
So
because having to put it into words really helps you understand or recognize how much you don't understand.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I thought I knew this, but I can't put it into words.
Yeah.
Do I really know it?
So true. Well, with that said, thank you guys both for coming. It's such a fun conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Brandy.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're following us in your favorite podcast player so you don't miss any of our episodes. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scoleysisters.com/SS111 to check it out. Don't forget to register for the annual retreat. It's going to be here before you know it. Just go to scoleysisters.com/habit and sign up. Our next episode is the third and final installment in our 3-part series on building an educational philosophy. Misty, Abby, and I will be discussing the classic question of, what does a well-educated person look like? It's going to be so much fun. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. Sorry, I'm trying to find the button.